For more than half a century, Bose was the most hated audio company in the audiophile world, and the most beloved in everyone else's living room. Owners praised the spaciousness. Critics published measurement charts that said the sound was wrong. The arguments did not end. They became permanent. And then, in January 2020, 4 weeks before the world locked down for a pandemic that nobody had heard of yet, Bose Corporation announced it was closing every one of its 119 retail stores in North America, Europe, Japan, and Australia. The closures had nothing to do with COVID. They were the official end of a particular Bose era and the beginning of a much quieter one. To understand how the company got there, you have to go back to a Christmas in Boston in 1956, and a young engineer who walked into a hi-fi shop and decided the entire industry was wrong. The young engineer was named Amar Gopal Bose. He had been born in Philadelphia in November 1929 to Noni Gopal Bose, an Indian independence activist who had emigrated from Calcutta a decade earlier and married an American schoolteacher. The family was not wealthy. During the Second World War, the import duties imposed on Indian goods made his father's small importing business untenable, and Amar, then 13 years old, started a radio repair business out of his family's basement in West Philadelphia to help cover household expenses. He fixed neighborhood radios on a workbench his father built him, with parts scavenged from broken sets, and he charged what the customer could afford. By the time he reached high school, the basement repair business was the most reliable source of income in the household. The pattern would repeat itself for the next 70 years. Amar Bose was happiest when he had a soldering iron in his hand and a circuit on his bench. He went to MIT as an undergraduate in 1947, stayed for graduate school, completed his doctorate in electrical engineering in 1956, and was offered a faculty position by his thesis advisor, the legendary Norbert Wiener, almost immediately. He would remain on the MIT faculty for the next 45 years. The students who took his acoustics and sound reproduction course in the basement of Building 10 still talk about the lectures decades later. Bose was not a polished speaker. He stuttered occasionally. He drew on the chalkboard with the intensity of a man who was still actively figuring out the answer in real time. He treated every student question as a serious technical problem. The lab he ran later in his career, on the upper floors of MIT's electrical engineering building, was famous for its strict policy that nobody in the lab was permitted to read industry literature on loudspeaker design before they had derived the relevant equations themselves. Bose did not want his graduate students contaminated by the assumptions of the existing audio industry, because he believed those assumptions were wrong. The story Amar Bose told for the rest of his life, in interviews, in lectures, and in his own internal company history, traced back to one specific shopping trip. In December 1956, he wanted to buy a high-quality loudspeaker for his apartment in Cambridge. He went to a hi-fi store in Boston, listened carefully to the most expensive speakers in the showroom, and purchased the unit the salesperson recommended. He set it up at home. Within an evening, he was disappointed. The sound coming out of his living room did not sound like the sound he had heard at recent Boston Symphony performances. The instruments were not located in the right places. The room around the music had been flattened. He spent the next 8 years, on top of his MIT teaching load, investigating why. The conclusion he reached was unconventional in 1956 and remained controversial for the rest of his life. Bose argued that loudspeaker design had been measured against the wrong target. The standard target was anechoic flatness, the speaker producing the same response inside a chamber with no reflections at all. The real listening environment, he argued, was a normal living room with walls and a ceiling and a couch and reflective surfaces everywhere. About 80% of the sound a listener perceived was reflected sound, not direct sound. A speaker that measured perfectly in an anechoic chamber would not necessarily reproduce music correctly in a real room. This conclusion led directly to the founding of Bose Corporation in 1964, and to the company's first product, a professional power amplifier module called the 2201. The amplifier sold poorly. The company nearly went bankrupt in its first 3 years. The young company operated out of a single rented industrial building in Natick, Massachusetts, with fewer than a dozen employees, most of them former MIT graduate students who had come along with Bose from his lab. Cash flow was so tight in 1965 and 1966 that Amar Bose personally drove the prototype amplifiers to potential customers in his car, and several times in the company's early history, he covered payroll out of his MIT salary. Sherwin Greenblatt, an MIT graduate student of Bose's who joined the company at its founding and later served as its president for decades, would later describe the period as the closest the corporation ever came to outright failure. What saved it was the second product, launched 4 years later, which was the most controversial loudspeaker ever sold to the American consumer. The Bose 901 direct reflecting loudspeaker arrived in 1968. It was a tall, mostly wooden cabinet about the size of a small dresser, containing 9 identical 4.5-inch full-range drivers. 8 of those drivers faced backward, toward the wall behind the speaker. 1 faced forward toward the listener. The unit could not be operated as a normal speaker. It was sold with a Bose-branded active equalizer, a small electronic box that the customer had to install in the audio chain between the preamplifier and the power amplifier. Without the equalizer, the speaker sounded broken. With the equalizer engaged and the speakers correctly placed several feet out from the listening room's rear wall, the 901 produced an unusually wide, enveloping, room-filling sound that customers in showrooms found genuinely thrilling. The audiophile press did not find it thrilling. They found it appalling. J. Gordon Holt, the founder of Stereophile magazine and the most influential audiophile critic of the era, dismissed the 901 in print as a kind of acoustic parlor trick. The argument from the audiophile camp was technical and consistent. The 901 produced a frequency response when measured in an anechoic chamber that looked like a roller coaster. Peaks, troughs, dramatic deviations from flat. The required equalizer existed, the critics argued, specifically because the underlying speaker was so far from neutral that it needed extensive electronic correction to be listenable at all. Stereo Review and High Fidelity, the 2 largest American hi-fi consumer magazines of that era, ran cautious reviews that praised the 901's spaciousness while quietly noting the unconventional measurement profile. The smaller, more rigorous audiophile journals were not cautious at all. Audio Magazine in particular published several articles over the course of the 1970s that took apart the Bose design philosophy section by section, with measurement plots and technical commentary aimed at any reader willing to follow the math. The room reflections that Bose's design relied on were not, the critics said, a feature. They were a smokescreen, used to obscure the fact that the underlying drivers were not high quality, and that the cabinet design was driven by manufacturing economics rather than acoustic principles. Bose Corporation responded by refusing to publish frequency response specifications for any of its loudspeakers, ever, in any product literature for the rest of the company's history. That refusal hardened in the 1970s and never softened. By 1980, Bose, no highs, no lows, must be Bose, had become the most repeated audiophile insult in the English language, told in stereo shops from Manhattan to Akihabara, as if it were a piece of folk wisdom that had always been with us. What the audiophile press underestimated throughout that entire decade was that Bose did not need them. While the high-end magazines were publishing furious takedowns of the 901, the Bose Corporation was doing something the audio industry had never properly tried. It was advertising directly, aggressively, and continuously to the mass-market American consumer. Bose ran full-page color ads in airline in-flight magazines, in the Sunday Parade insert of regional newspapers, in the back of Time and Newsweek, and eventually in every direct mail catalog Sears, Brookstone, and Hammacher Schlemmer would carry. The print advertising itself became a recognizable visual identity. The standard Bose ad of the late 1970s and early 1980s used a clean white background, a single large product photograph shot from a slightly elevated angle, and a body copy block written in long conversational paragraphs that read more like a friendly explanation than a sales pitch. Within the body copy, Bose described the listening experience as the customer would experience it, and quietly redirected attention away from the technical specifications a competing brand might publish. The advertising agency that helped develop that visual style, Mintz and Hoke, worked with Bose for decades. The company's tagline, "Better sound through research," was repeated so consistently across so many channels for so long that it became, for an entire generation of American consumers, simply what the phrase Bose meant. The advertising bypassed the audiophile press entirely. It did not cite measurements. It did not engage technical objections. It described the listening experience the customer would have in the customer's own living room, in plain language. The strategy worked. By the late 1970s, Bose was outselling almost every traditional audiophile loudspeaker brand in unit volume in the United States, despite an audiophile press that had effectively declared the company a fraud. The 1980s brought two new product categories that defined the next phase of the company. In 1984, Bose launched the Wave Radio. It was a tabletop AM and FM clock radio, no larger than a loaf of bread, that the company priced at $499 in 1984 dollars. That was an outrageous price for a clock radio. To justify it, Bose marketing leaned heavily on its proprietary acoustic waveguide speaker technology. A folded internal tube that the company claimed allowed the unit to produce bass response far in excess of what a small enclosure should be capable of. Audiophiles, predictably, dismissed the acoustic waveguide as a marketing frame around an old organ pipe acoustic principle. Customers, equally predictably, did not care. The Wave Radio sold by direct mail order through the Bose toll-free number with a satisfaction guarantee. It sold in volumes nobody in the radio category had seen in decades. By the late 1990s, the Wave Radio franchise had become its own product line, with successor units, CD-equipped models, and eventually networked variants that collectively brought hundreds of millions of dollars per year through the Framingham accounting department. The other defining product of the 1980s was the Bose Acoustimass speaker system, launched in 1986. It split a traditional home stereo loudspeaker pair into a single, hidden bass module, sold under the Acoustimass name, and a pair of small, visible cube speakers for the higher frequencies. The bass module could be tucked under a sofa or behind a curtain. The cubes could be mounted on the wall. The whole system traded the visual presence of a traditional stereo speaker for the appearance of almost no audio equipment in the room at all. It was, in retrospect, the moment when American living room audio crossed a threshold from being a furniture-class object that a household intentionally displayed to being an appliance-class object that a household intentionally hid. Bose did not create that cultural shift on its own, but it productized it earlier and more aggressively than anyone else. And it sold the Acoustimass into millions of American homes through the same direct mail and Sky Mall and Brookstone channels that had built the Wave Radio. The audiophile press treated the Acoustimass with the same contempt they had aimed at the 901 in 1968. The mass-market consumer did not read the audiophile press. The growing tension between the Bose marketing machine and the audio reviewer establishment did not stay rhetorical forever. It went to court. In 1970, Consumer Reports magazine, published by the nonprofit organization Consumers Union, ran a review of the Bose 901 that included a phrase suggesting the speakers caused musical instruments to wander about the room. Bose Corporation sued Consumers Union for product disparagement, alleging that the review's wording was knowingly misleading and had injured the company's reputation. The case went through a long trial and was decided initially in Bose's favor at the federal district court level, with a damages award. Consumers Union appealed. The case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which decided Bose Corporation versus Consumers Union in 1984 in a 6-3 opinion that reversed the lower court ruling on First Amendment grounds. The decision became a foundational precedent in American defamation law, particularly in the context of product reviews and journalism. For Bose Corporation, the case was a defeat. For American consumer journalism, it was a major win. The court's reasoning, written by Justice John Paul Stevens, established that an appellate court reviewing a finding of actual malice in a product review must independently examine the record and not merely defer to the trial court. It is today taught in nearly every American media law course. The Bose name is in the case caption. For most of the 1990s, Bose continued to grow as a private company. Amar Bose remained the chairman. His son Vanu Bose ran a sister company called Bose Acoustic Wave, and the family controlled the corporation outright. There was no public stock. There was no annual report. The company did not disclose financials. It plowed its margins back into research, expanded its automotive original equipment business with car makers like Audi and Cadillac, and quietly maintained one of the largest patent portfolios in consumer audio. The company's reputation among audiophiles continued to be terrible. Its reputation among mass-market consumers continued to be excellent. The two demographics did not overlap, and Bose did not appear to want them to. The Framingham campus during this era took on the character of a small, slightly secretive engineering town. The main research building, set back from a wooded boundary off Route 9, contained anechoic chambers, listening rooms, materials labs, and a vehicle bay where prototype car audio installations could be tested in actual cabin acoustics. The internal culture was deliberately academic. Technical disagreements were resolved by experiment, not by hierarchy. New employees were given long onboarding programs that walked them through the company's design philosophy from first principles. Visiting journalists were generally not permitted past the front lobby. The company's senior engineers, several of whom had been recruited directly out of MIT in the 1970s, in many cases stayed for 30 or 40 years. Bose did not behave like a normal American corporation. It behaved like an extension of the academic acoustics department it had originally grown out of. What changed the cultural conversation around Bose, more than any product the company ever sold to a living room, was a small, foldable, over-ear headphone introduced in the year 2000. The QuietComfort, sold initially as the QC1 and later just as the QC, was the first consumer-grade active noise-canceling headphone. It used a small microphone outside each ear cup to detect ambient noise, and a small electronic circuit inside each ear cup to generate a precisely inverted waveform that canceled that noise before it reached the listener's ear. The technology had existed for years inside aviation and military headsets. In fact, Bose's own active noise cancellation research had begun decades earlier, when Amar Bose, on a transatlantic flight in 1978, had been unable to enjoy a pair of in-flight stereo headphones over the cabin noise of the airliner he was sitting in. He had reportedly sketched the basic schematic for a noise-canceling headphone on a napkin during the flight. The product Bose actually shipped in 2000 was the result of more than 2 decades of internal development on that idea, including a long detour through aviation headsets sold to military pilots and commercial airline crews. Bose was the first company to package it for the consumer at a tolerable size, weight, and battery life. Within 5 years, the QuietComfort had become the de facto headphone of the American business traveler. Walk through the priority boarding line at any major American airport in 2005, and a substantial percentage of the elite frequent flyers were wearing white-corded, silver-capped Bose headphones. The QuietComfort line evolved through the QC2, QC3, QC15, QC25, QC35, and QC45 models, picking up Bluetooth, longer battery life, better cancellation circuitry, and eventually a touch control interface, while keeping a remarkably consistent product identity. For the first time in the company's history, audiophile critics were quiet about a Bose product. Some of them, in private, owned a pair. The other major event of the late period of Amar Bose's life had nothing to do with a specific product, and everything to do with the long-term ownership structure of the company. In November 2011, MIT announced that Amar Bose had donated the majority of the shares of Bose Corporation to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the institution where he had taught for 45 years. The shares were structured as non-voting. MIT could not sell them. MIT did not gain operational control of the company. What MIT received, in perpetuity, was a stream of dividends from the corporation intended to support research and education at the institute. The Bose family retained voting control. The corporation continued to operate it exactly as it had operated in 2010. Amar Bose, when asked about the donation by the New York Times, described it as the natural conclusion of a lifelong relationship with MIT and as a way of ensuring that the company he founded could never be sold to a financial buyer or taken public. He died less than 2 years later, on July 12, 2013, at the age of 83 at his home in Wayland, Massachusetts. The company he founded continued, the way he had structured it, with the family running operations and MIT collecting a perpetual share of the profits. By the time Amar Bose died, the audio industry he had spent 50 years competing in was already changing, in ways the Bose product line was poorly positioned to handle. The cultural center of consumer audio was moving away from the traditional stereo system, away from the dedicated home theater, and toward a wireless ecosystem of small networked speakers, mobile phones, and streaming services. The company that defined the new direction was Sonos, founded in Santa Barbara, California in 2002. Sonos did not build especially good speakers in the audiophile sense. Its drivers were unremarkable. Its cabinets were small. What Sonos built was a software platform, a wireless multi-room synchronization protocol, and a control application that worked across an iPhone, an iPad, and a laptop, and that integrated cleanly with whatever streaming service the customer was using. By the early 2010s, the Sonos system had defined a new product category that Bose had never anticipated needing to compete in. Bose responded with the Sound Touch line in 2013, and later with the Bose home speaker family. Neither response caught fire. The hardware was acceptable. The software was clearly behind. The platform did not develop the third-party integrations that Sonos quietly accumulated. By 2018, Sonos had a defensible position in the wireless audio category that Bose, despite a substantially larger budget and a much older brand, had been unable to dislodge. The headphone category turned against the company too, although the timing took longer to play out. In December 2016, Apple released the AirPods, a small, white, in-ear, true wireless earphone, packaged in a case the size of a dental floss container. The AirPods had no noise cancellation. The sound quality was, by any audiophile measure, acceptable but not extraordinary. What the AirPods had was deep integration with the iPhone, automatic pairing across an Apple ID, and a price point that made them an impulse purchase rather than a considered audio investment. They sold in volumes that no headphone, in any category, had ever achieved. By 2020, the AirPods franchise alone was generating revenue larger than the entire Bose Corporation. The over-ear noise-canceling category, which Bose had defined and dominated for 16 years, faced a parallel disruption from Sony, whose WH-1000X line, beginning with the original M model in 2016 and accelerating through the M3, M4, and M5, eventually offered noise cancellation that most independent reviewers considered to be either equal to or better than the latest Bose QuietComfort. Bose had not lost the headphone market by 2020, but it was no longer the obvious default, which is the financial and competitive context inside which Bose Corporation made the decision, in January 2020, to close every retail store it operated outside of mainland China and the United Arab Emirates. The press release was short, polite, and unsentimental. It cited the dramatic shift in consumer shopping behavior toward online channels. It noted that the company would now sell direct through Bose.com, through select third-party online retailers, and through a smaller network of authorized dealers. It said that approximately 1,000 store employees in North America, Europe, Japan, and Australia would be affected. It thanked them for their service. The total number of stores closed was 119. The closures were announced on January 14, 2020, more than a month before the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus outbreak a pandemic, and were not contrary to a widespread later misremembering caused by COVID-19. They were a separate prior decision made by Bose management about a retail strategy the company had concluded was no longer viable in the markets where it had previously been profitable. The pandemic, which began affecting American retail 2 months later, simply made the closure decision look prescient. The shopping mall locations being closed had, in many cases, been Bose institutions for 2 decades or more. The Bose store in the Mall of America, in Bloomington, Minnesota, had been a fixture of the second floor since the late 1990s. The Bose store on Fifth Avenue near Rockefeller Center in New York had been one of the highest revenue per square foot retail locations in Midtown Manhattan during its peak years. The Bose stores in Heathrow Airport's Terminal 5 and at Tokyo's Narita Airport had been a familiar sight to international business travelers for an entire generation. Each of those locations was, on January 14, 2020, given a wind-down date. By the early summer of that year, the storefronts had been emptied, the signage had been removed, and the spaces had reverted to the property managers, who in many cases then sat vacant for the remainder of the year, as the broader retail real estate market collapsed under pandemic conditions. The closures were the most visible event of a broader, quieter contraction. Through 2020 and into 2021, Bose Corporation laid off corporate employees in Framingham and at its regional offices, restructured its product organization around a smaller number of focused categories, and reduced its physical footprint at the original Massachusetts headquarters. The Wave Radio, in its later networked variants, ended production. The Bose 901, the loudspeaker that had defined the original audiophile war and had remained in continuous production for 48 years, had already ended production in 2016, before the retail collapse. The Acoustimass home theater systems were quietly trimmed to a small remaining lineup. The new Bose was a smaller, more focused company with a clear emphasis on 3 categories. The QuietComfort and Bose earbud headphone lines remained the company's most visible consumer product. The soundbar and smart speaker lines, including the Soundbar 900 and the Smart Soundbar series, addressed the modern living room, although in a far more crowded competitive field than the Acoustimass had faced in 1986. And the original equipment automotive business, supplying premium audio systems to a long list of car manufacturers, continued to provide a steady, less visible, but materially significant share of the company's revenue. What happened to the audiophile war is the strangest part of the whole story. It did not end in a victory. It ended in something closer to indifference. The audiophile establishment that had fought the Bose 901 in 1968, that had rejoiced in the Supreme Court ruling against Bose in 1984, that had repeated "no highs, no lows, must be Bose" for 50 straight years, did not get to celebrate the closure of the Bose retail empire. By 2020, the audiophile press itself had become a much smaller, much more niche cultural force. Stereophile and the Absolute Sound still published. They still reviewed equipment. They still expressed strong opinions. But they were operating inside a hobbyist subculture, not inside a mainstream consumer category that mattered to the broader public. The argument the audiophiles had been having with Bose about whether anechoic measurement should be the gold standard for loudspeaker quality simply stopped mattering to most people, because most people no longer owned a stereo system at all. They owned a Bluetooth speaker, a pair of wireless earbuds, and a soundbar in the living room. The frame of the original argument had collapsed. What survives of Bose in 2026 is, in the strictest sense, still very much alive. The corporation remains private, family-controlled at the operational level, and majority-owned at the share level by MIT. It still operates from the original Framingham, Massachusetts campus that Amar Bose built it on, although in a smaller portion of that campus than at the company's peak. It still ships QuietComfort headphones in volumes large enough to support an active product roadmap. It still supplies premium audio systems to several major automotive manufacturers. It still files patents, defends them when challenged, and conducts internal acoustic research at a level that would have made Amar Bose proud. The company is, by the standard a Wall Street analyst would use, a healthy, mid-sized private consumer electronics business, profitable enough to sustain its dividend obligations to MIT and to fund continued product development. What does not survive is the broader cultural position the company occupied for most of the second half of the 20th century. There was a 30-year period, roughly from 1975 to 2005, during which the word Bose, in casual American conversation, did not refer to a specific product line. It referred to a vague but reassuring idea of high-quality home audio. It was the brand that a certain kind of upper-middle-class American household bought when they wanted something nicer than a generic system and did not want to do the work of becoming an actual audiophile. It was the brand that filled airline in-flight catalogs, that lined the shelves at Brookstone, that sat behind glass at the airport boutique near Gate B12. That cultural position is gone. It dissolved through a combination of the streaming era, the soundbar era, the AirPod era, the audiophile irrelevance era, and finally and concretely, the January 2020 retail closure that removed the physical Bose store from the American shopping mall altogether. The audiophile war did not end with anyone walking off the field. It ended because the field itself was paved over. There is, in that fact, a quiet irony Amar Bose might have appreciated. The man who started Bose Corporation because he believed the audio industry was measuring loudspeakers against the wrong standard, and who built his company in opposition to the audiophile establishment, ultimately watched both the audiophile establishment and his own retail empire fade out together, undone by the same broader shift in how American consumers actually listen to music, which turned out to be, in the end, neither in an anechoic chamber nor in a carefully arranged living room, but on the bus, on the subway, on a long flight, or while doing the dishes, with a small wireless device in or near the ear. The 901, viewed from this distance, looks less like the acoustic parlor trick the audiophile press accused it of being, and more like a strange, prescient, and ultimately misunderstood attempt to take the listening environment seriously as part of the design. The arguments Amar Bose made in the late 1960s about reflected sound and the role of the room in the listening experience are, in 2026, taken for granted in modern loudspeaker design, where most serious manufacturers now publish in-room measurements alongside anechoic ones, and where the entire field of room correction software, from Odyssey to Dirac to Sonarworks, exists to do exactly the kind of compensation Bose's external equalizer was attempting in 1968. The technical execution in the original 901 was clearly imperfect. The underlying argument, that the room matters and the listening experience cannot be reduced to a single anechoic curve, has been quietly absorbed into mainstream practice. None of the audiophile critics who fought the 901 most ferociously in its day ever publicly retracted their position. Most of them have since died. The argument simply receded. Somewhere in a suburban basement in Connecticut, or in a small hi-fi shop on the outskirts of Tokyo, an original Bose 901 from 1972 is still hanging on its custom pedestal stand, still wired through its battered original equalizer, still throwing the music of an entire generation into a room that the 1968 design brief had imagined, and that fewer and fewer Americans actually own anymore. The 901 will keep playing for as long as someone is willing to maintain the foam grills and the equalizer caps. The Bose retail stores will not reopen. The audiophile war will not be refought. The thing that ended in January 2020 was not the company, but the cultural moment the company had occupied. Bose, like Pioneer, like Onkyo, like the entire mid-century consumer audio business, has continued past the death of the era it was built for. It is operating, profitably, inside a smaller frame. If you want more stories like this one, the slow deaths of the cultural empires that defined the consumer century, subscribe. There are more obituaries coming, and they keep arriving at the same quiet pace this one did.